By the time he had reached the pavement, Cosmo had mastered his trembling and had steadied his thoughts. He wanted to keep away from that house for hours. He glanced right and left, hesitating. In the whole town he knew only the way to the palazzo and the way to the port. He took the latter direction. He walked by the faint starlight falling into the narrow streets resembling lofty, unroofed corridors, as if the whole town had been one palace, recognizing on his way the massive shape of one or two jutting balconies he remembered seeing before, and also a remarkable doorway, the arch of which was held up by bowed giants with flowing beards, like two captive sons of the gods of the sea. Chapter 3. At the moment when Cosmo was leaving his room to escape the haunting vision of an old picture representing a beautiful martyr with a dagger in her breast, Dr. Martel was at work finishing what he called a confidential memorandum, which he proposed to hand over to the Marquis d'Armand. The doctor applied very high standards of honor and fidelity to his appreciation of men's character. He had a very great respect for the old Marquis. He was anxious to make him the recipient of that crop of valuable, out-of-the-way information, interesting to the French Bourbons, which he had gathered lately. Having sat up half the night, he slept late and was just finishing shaving when, a little before 11 o'clock, there was a knock at his door, and Cantalucci entered. The innkeeper offered no apology for this intrusion, but announced without preliminaries that the young English gentleman had vanished during the night from the inn. The woman who took the chocolate in the morning upstairs found no servant ready to receive it as usual. The bedroom door was ajar. After much hesitation, she had ventured to put her head through. The shutters being open, she had seen that the bed had not been slept in. The doctor left off dabbing his cheeks with eau de cologne, and turned to stare at the innkeeper. At last he shrugged his shoulders slightly. Cantalucci took the point immediately. Yes, but in this case it was impossible to dismiss the affair lightly. The young English signore had not been much more than 48 hours in Genoa. He had no time to make many acquaintances, and in any case Cantalucci thought he ought to have been back by this time. The doctor picked up his wig and adjusted it on his head thoughtfully, like a considering cap. That simple action altered his physiognomy so completely that Cantalucci was secretly affected. He made one of his austerely deferential bows, which seemed to put the whole matter into the doctor's hands at once. "You seem very much upset," said the doctor. "Have you seen his servant? He must know something." "I doubt it, Excellency. He has been upstairs to open the shutters, of course. He is now at the front door, looking out. I did speak to him. He had too much wine last evening and fell asleep with his head on the table. I saw him myself before I retired." The doctor, preserving a sort of watchful silence, Cantalucci added that he himself had retired early on account of one of those periodical headaches he had suffered from since the days of his youth, when he had been chained up in the dungeons of St. Elmo for months. The doctor thought the fellow did look as though he had had a bad night. "Why didn't you come to see me? You know I can cure worse ailments." The innkeeper raised his hands in horror at the mere idea. He would never have dared to disturb His Excellency for such a trifle as a headache. But the cause of his trouble was quite other. A partisan of the revolutionary French from his early youth, Cantalucci had been an active conspirator against the old order of things. Now that kings and priests were raising their heads out of the dust, he had again become very busy. The latest matter in hand had been the sending of some important documents to the conspirators in the south. He had found the messenger. had taken steps for getting him away secretly, had given him full instructions the last thing before going to bed. The young fellow was brave, intelligent, and resourceful beyond the common. But somehow the very perfection of his arrangements kept the old conspirator awake. He reviewed them again and again. He could not have done better. At last he fell asleep, but almost immediately it seemed to him he was roused by the old crone whose task it was to light the fires in the morning. Sordid and witch-like, she conveyed to him in a toothless mumble the intelligence that Cheka was in the kitchen, all in tears and demanding to see him at once. This Cheka was primarily and principally a pretty girl, an orphan left to his care by his late sister. She was not consulted when her uncle, of whom she stood in awe, married her to the middle-aged owner of a wine shop in the low quarter of the town, extending along the shore near the harbor. He was good-natured, slow-witted, and heavy-handed at times, but Cheka was much less afraid of him than of her austere uncle. It amused her to be the padrona of an osteria, which in the days of empire was a notable resort for the officers of French privateers. But on the peace that clientele had disappeared, and Cheka's husband, leaving the wine casks to her management, employed his leisure in petty smuggling operations which kept him away from home. Cantalucci connected his niece's irruption with some trouble that men might have got into. He was vexed. He had other matters to think of. He was astonished by the violence of her grief. When she could speak at last, her tale turned out to be more in the nature of a confession. The old conspirator could hardly believe his ears when he heard that the man whom he had trusted had committed the crime of betraying the secrecy of his mission by going to the osteria late at night to say good-bye to Cheka. She assured him that he had been there only a very few moments. "What, in a wine shop? Before all the people? With spies swarming everywhere?" "No," she said. It was much later. Everybody was gone. He had scratched at the barred door.
"And you were on the other side, waiting to let him in, miserable girl,"
Cantalucci hissed ferociously. She stared at her terrible uncle with streaming eyes.
"Yes, I was."
She had not the heart to refuse him. He stayed only a little moment. Cantalucci ground his teeth with rage. It was the first he had heard of this affair. Here was a most promising plot endangered by this bestialita. Only one little hug, and then she pushed him out herself. Before she had finished putting up the bar, she heard a tumult in the street. Shots, too. Perhaps she would have rushed out, but her husband was home for a few days. He came down to the wine shop very cross and boxed her ears, she did not know why. Perhaps for being in the shop at that late hour. That did not matter, but he drove her before him up the stairs, and she had to sham sleep for hours, till he began to snore regularly. She had grown so desperate that she took the risk of running out and telling her uncle all about it. She thought he ought to know. What brought her to the inn really was a faint hope that Attilio, having eluded the assassins, she was sure they were assassins, had taken refuge there unscathed, or wounded, perhaps. She said nothing of this, however. Before Cantalucci's stony bearing, she broke down.
"He's dead, poverino. My own hands pushed him to his death,"
she moaned to herself crazily, standing in front of her silent uncle before the blazing kitchen fire in the yet slumbering house. Rage kept Cantalucci dumb. He was as shocked by what he had heard as the most rigid moralist could desire. But he was a conspirator, and all he could see in this was the criminal conduct of those young people who ought to have thought of nothing but the liberation of Italy. for Attilio had taken the oath of the Carbonari, and Cecca belonged to the women's organization of that secret society. She was an ortolana, as they called themselves. He had initiated her and was responsible for her conduct. The baseness, the stupidity, the frivolity, the selfishness. By severe exercise of self-restraint, he refrained from throwing her out into the street, all in tears, as she was. He only muttered awfully at her, "Get out of my sight, you little fool," with a menacing gesture. But she stood her ground. She never flinched before his raised hand, and as it felt harmless by his side, she seized it in both her own, pressing it to her lips and breast in turn, whispering the while all sorts of endearing names at the infuriated Cantalucci. He heard the sounds of his staff beginning the work of the day, their voices, their footsteps. They would wonder, but his niece did not care. She clung to his hand, and he did not get rid of her till he had actually promised to send her news directly he had heard something himself. And she even thought of the means. There was that fine sailor with black whiskers in attendance on the English officers frequenting the hotel. He was a good-natured man. He knew the way to the wine shop. This reminded her of her husband. What if he should wake in her absence? And still distracted, she ran off at last, leaving Cantalucci to face the situation. He was dismayed. He did not really know what had happened, not to his messenger, but to the documents. The old conspirator, battling with his thoughts, moved so silent and stern amongst his people that nobody dared approach him for a couple of hours. And when they did at last come to him with the news of the young milord's disappearance, he simply swore at them. But as the morning advanced, he came to the conclusion that for various reasons it would be best for him to seek his old benefactor. He did so with a harassed face which caused the doctor to believe in the story of a sleepless night. Of course, he spoke only of Cosmo's absence. The doctor, leaning back against the edge of his dressing-table, gazed silently at the innkeeper. He was profoundly disturbed by the intelligence. "Got your snuff-box on you?" he asked. The alacrity of Cantalucci in producing his snuff-box was equaled by the deferential flourish with which he held it out to his benefactor. "The young English signore," he remarked, "visited the Palazzo of the Griffins the evening before." The doctor helped himself to a pinch. "He didn't spend the night there, though," he observed. "You know who lives in the palazzo, don't you, Cantalucci? Some Piedmontese general, I understand, Your Excellency," said Cantalucci, who had been in touch with Count Elion ever since the Austrian occupation, and had even forwarded secretly 1 or 2 letters for the Count to Elba. But these were addressed to a grain merchant in Portoferraio. "I will open all my mind to Your Excellency," continued Cantalucci. "An English milord is a person of consequence. If I were to report his disappearance, the police would be coming here to make investigation. I don't want any police in my house." The doctor lost his meditative air. "I dare say you don't," he said grimly. "I recommend myself to Your Excellency's protective influence," murmured Cantalucci insinuatingly. The doctor let drop the pinch of snuff between his thumb and finger. "And he may have come back while we are talking here," he said hopefully. "Go down, Cantalucci, and send me my courier." But the doctor's man was already at the door, bringing the brushed clothes over his arm. While dressing, the doctor speculated on the mystery. It baffled all his conjectures. A man may go out in the evening for a breath of fresh air and get knocked on the head. But how unlikely! He spoke casually to his man, who was ministering to him in gloomy silence. "You will have to step over to the police presently and find out whether anything has happened last night. Do it quietly." "I understand," said the courier surlily. The thought that the fellow had been drunk recently crossed the doctor's mind. "Whom were you drinking with last night?" he asked sharply. "The English servant," confessed the courier valet grumpily. "His master let him off his services last night." "Yes, and you made him pay the shot." With these words the doctor left the room. While crossing the great hall downstairs, he had the view of Spire's back framed in the entrance doorway. The valet had not apparently budged from there since 7. So Mr. Latham had not returned. In the dining room there were only 2 naval officers at the table reserved for them, the elderly gentleman in his usual place at the head, and a round-faced, florid person in a bobbed wig, who might have been the ship's surgeon. During their meal the doctor did not hear them exchange a single remark. They went away together, and after the last of the town customers had left the room too, the doctor sat alone before his table, toying with a half-empty glass thoughtfully. His grave face was startlingly at variance with the short, abrupt laugh which he emitted as he rose, pushing his chair back. It was provoked by the thought that only last evening he had been urging half-jestingly his young countryman to leave Genoa in one of the conventional ways, by road or sea, and now he was gone with a vengeance, spirited away, by Jove. The doctor was startled at the profound change of his own feelings. Count Eleon's venomous, "I don't want that popinjay here," did not sound so funny in his recollection now. Very extraordinary things could and did happen under the run of everyday life. Was it possible that the word of the riddle could be found there? He asked himself. This investigator of the secret discontents and aspirations of his time had never shut his ears to the mere social gossip that came in his way. He had lived long, he remembered much. For instance, he could remember things that were said about Sir Charles Latham long before Cosmo was born. As to the story of the Monteveso marriage, that had made noise enough in its time in society, and also amongst the French émigrés. Its celebration, the subsequent differences, reconciliations, recriminations, and final arrangement had kept idle tongues wagging for years. Of course, it was that match which had given that dubious Monteveso his social standing, and what followed had invested that absurd individual with the celebrity of a character out of a Molière comedy, Le Jaloux, the elderly, jealous husband. Comic enough. But that was the sort of comedy that soon takes a tragic turn. A special provocation, a sudden opportunity, are enough. What puzzled the doctor was the suddenness of the problem. Yet one could not tell what an orientalized brute, no stranger probably to palace murders, had not the means of doing. He might have been harboring in that barn of a palace some retainers of a deadly kind, a Corsican desperado, or a couple of rascals from his own native mountains. Had he not 2 unattractive old peasant women concealed there? The doctor believed that unlikely things happened every day. This view was not the result of inborn credulity, but of much acquired knowledge of a secret sort. A serious, fastidious, and obviously earnest-minded young man like Latham was particularly liable to get into trouble of a grave kind. A manifestation of perfectly innocent sympathy could do it, and even less. An unguarded glance, an unconscious warmth of tone, confound it! Yet he could not let a young countryman of his, a nice, likable young gentleman, vanish from under his nose without taking some steps. The doctor stepped out into the hall, attractively dim and cool in the middle of the day. Spire had disappeared, but the doctor had given up the hope of Cosmo's return. In a dark corner he perceived the shadowy shape of a cocked hat. and made out the old lieutenant leaning back against the wall with his arms crossed and his chin on his breast. He had a bottle of wine and a glass standing in front of him. I suppose, thought the doctor, this is what he comes ashore for. The product of 20 years of war. The reeking loom that converted such as he into food for guns had stopped suddenly. There would be no demand for heroes for a long, long time, and somehow the fact that the fellow had all his limbs about him made him even more pathetic. The doctor had almost forgotten Cosmo. He did not notice Spire coming down the stairs, and he started at the sound of the words, "I beg your pardon, sir," uttered almost in his ears. The elderly valet was very much shaken. He said in a low murmur, "I am nearly out of my mind, sir. My master—" "I know," interrupted the doctor. He pounced upon Spire like a bird of prey. "Come, what do you know about it?" This reception roused Spire's dislike of that sour and offhand person, like no medical man he had ever seen, and certainly no gentleman. On the principle, like master, like man, Spire was more sensitive to manner than to any trait of personality. He pulled himself together and steadied his voice. "I know nothing, sir, except that you were the last person seen speaking to Mr. Latham." "You don't think I've got him in my pocket, do you?" asked Dr. Martell, noting the hostile stare. "Don't you attend your master when he retires for the night?" "I got dismissed early last night. I am sorry to say I sat downstairs after supper very late, listening to tales about one thing and another. I went to sleep there," added Spire with a sort of desperation. "Listening to tales?" repeated the doctor jeeringly. "Pretty tales they must have been, too. Zillers is no company for a respectable English servant. You ought to be ashamed of yourself. Well, and then?" "I went up, sir, and—" "In the middle of the night?" suggested the doctor. "It was pretty late. He faltered at the remembrance. The waking up in the cold, dark kitchen, the cold, dark staircase, the light shining through the keyhole of Mr. Cosmo's bedroom, the first vague feeling that there was something wrong, the empty room, and, most awful of all, the bed not slept in, and the candles in the candelabras burning low. He remembered his horror, incredulity, his collapse into an armchair where he sat till broad daylight in a pitiable state of mental agitation. A slight tremor passed through his portly frame before he forced himself to speak. "Mr. Latham had emptied his pockets, sir, as if he were making ready to go to bed. All the change and the keys were lying on the mantelpiece. One would think he had been kidnapped. Of course it can't be," he added in a low, intense tone. "Do you mean to say he disappeared without his hat?" asked the doctor. "No, sir. Hat and cloak aren't there." And to the doctor's further questions, Spire confessed that he had spoken to no one in the house that morning. He would only have been told lies. He did not think much of the people in the inn. "So I took the liberty of speaking to you, sir. Mr. Latham may turn up any moment, and I don't know that he would like to find that I have been to the police already." "No, perhaps he wouldn't," assented the doctor reflectively. "That's just it, sir," murmured Spire. "Mr. Cosmo is a very peculiar young gentleman. He doesn't like notice to be taken." "Doesn't he? Well, then, you had better wait before you go to the police. We had better give him till 4 o'clock. "Very well, sir," said Spire, fighting down his feeling that nothing in the world would be worse than this waiting. The doctor nodded dismissal, then at the last moment, "By the by, hadn't you better lock up all the papers that may be lying about?" Spire was favorably impressed by the suggestion.
"Yes, sir. We have a small strong-box with us. I will go and do it at once."
During that colloquy, conducted in low tones at the foot of the grand staircase, nobody had appeared in the hall, not even the vigilant Cantilucci. But the elderly lieutenant had raised his head, and his dull, uninterested eyes followed the doctor across the hall and out through the door into the sunshine of the square. In all its vast and paved extent, only very few figures were moving. The doctor's tastes and even his destiny had made of him a nocturnal visitor to the abodes of the great. At this time of the day, however, there was almost as little risk of being seen entering the palace of the Griffins as in the middle of the night. The populace, the shopkeepers, the Austrian garrison, the gendarmes, the sbirri, the spies, and even the conspirators were indulging in midday repose. The very team of dapple-gray horses, harnessed to an enormous two-wheeled cart drawn up in the shade, dozed over their empty nose-bags. Dogs slumbered in the doorways in utter abandonment, and only the bronze griffins, seated on their narrow pedestals of granite before the doorway of the palace, preserved their alert, wide-awake pose of everlasting watchfulness. They were really very fine, and the doctor gave them an appreciative glance before crossing the empty quadrangle. He felt the only wide-awake person in a slumbering world. He wondered if he would succeed in getting admitted to the palace. If not, he confessed to himself, he would be at a loss what to do next. Very disagreeable. He had, however, the memorandum for the Marquis in his pocket as a pretext for his visit. All was still without and within, but in the noble anteroom at the foot of the marble staircase he was met by a sight characteristic of the easy Italian ways. Extended face downward on one of the red and gold benches, one of the footmen in shirt-sleeves, and with his breeches untied at the knees, was sleeping profoundly. His disheveled head rested on his forearm. At an unceremonious poke in the ribs, he jumped up to his feet, looking scared and wild. But Dr. Martel was ready for him. "What's the matter, my friend?" he asked softly. "Is there a price set on your head?" The man remained open-mouthed, as if paralyzed by the caustic inquiry. "Fetch the major domo here," commanded the doctor, thinking that he had seldom seen a more bandit-like figure. While waiting, the doctor reflected that a livery coat was a good disguise. It occurred to him also that in the house of a man having such retainers all sorts of things might happen. This was Italy. The silence, as of a tomb, which pervaded the whole house, though nothing extraordinary in the hour of siesta, produced the effect of sinister mystery. The arrival of the sleek Bernard did not destroy that bad impression. The doctor, who had never seen him before by daylight, said to himself that this was no doubt only another kind of villain. On learning that the Marquis had been very ill during the night, and that Bernard could not think of taking in his name, the doctor inquired whether Madame de Monteveso would see him on most important business. To his great relief, because he had been asking himself all along how he could contrive to get private speech with the Countess, Bernard raised no objections. He simply went away. And again the dumbness around him grew oppressive to Dr. Martel. He fell into a brown study. This palace, famed for the treasures of art, for the splendors of its marbles and paintings and gildings, was no better than a gorgeous tomb. Men's vanity erected these magnificent abodes only to receive in them the unavoidable guest, death, with all the ceremonies of superstitious fear. The sense of human mortality evoked by this dumb palazzo was very disagreeable. He was relieved by the return of the noiseless Bernard. all in black and grave, like a sleek caretaker of that particular tomb, who stood before him saying in a low voice, "Follow me, please." Bernard introduced the doctor into a comparatively small, well-lighted boudoir. At the same moment, Madame de Monteviso entered it from her bedroom by another door. The doctor had an impression of a gown with a train trimmed with ribbons and lace, surmounted by a radiant, fair head. The face was pale. Madame de Monteviso had been up most of the night with her father. The Marquis was too ill to see anybody. The doctor expressed his regret in a formal tone. Meantime, he took out of his pocket the memoir, and begged Madame la Comtesse to keep it under lock and key till she could hand it over to her father. He was also in possession of information which he said would be of the greatest interest to the French court, but he could disclose it only to the French king or to Monsieur de Jaucourt. He was ready to proceed to Paris should the Marquis be impressed sufficiently by the memoir to procure for him a private audience from the king or the minister. This curt, businesslike declaration called out a smile on that charming face, just a flicker, a suspicion of it. He could not be offended with that glorious being. He felt only that he must assert himself. "I cannot deal with lesser people," he said simply. "This must be understood in Paris. I make my own conditions. I am not a hireling. Your father has known me for years. Monsieur le Marquis and I met in other dangerous times in various parts of Europe. Each of us was risking his life." The Marquis had often talked with his daughter of his past. She had heard from him of a certain agent Martel, a singular personage. Her curiosity was aroused. She said, "I know. I believe he was indebted to you for his safety on one occasion. I can understand my father's motives. But you will forgive me for saying that as to yours—" "Oh, it was not the love of absolutism. The fact is, I discovered early in life that I was not made for a country practice. I started on my travels with no definite purpose, except to do a little good here and there. I arrived in Italy while it was being revolutionized by Jacobins. I was not in love with them either. Humane impulses, circumstances, and so on, did the rest." He looked straight at her. This tete-a-tete was a unique experience. She was a marvelous being somehow, and a very great lady. And yet she was as simple as a village maid, a glorified village maid. The trials of a life of exile and poverty had stripped her of the faintest trace of affectation or artificiality of any kind. The doctor was lost in wonder. What humanizing force there was in the beauty of that face to make him talk like that the first time he saw her. And suddenly the thought, "Her face has been her fortune," came to him with great force, evoking by the side of her noble unconscious grace the stiff wooden figure of Count de Monteviso. The effect was horrible, but the doctor's hard gray eyes betrayed neither his horror nor his indignation. He only asked Madame de Monteviso, who was locking up his memoir in the drawer of a little writing-table, if it would be safe there, and was told that nobody ever came into the room but a confidential mulatto maid who had been with the Countess for years. "Yes, as far as you know," the doctor ventured significantly. With this beginning, he found no difficulty in discovering that Madame de Monteviso knew nothing of the composition of the household. She did not know how many servants there were. She had not been interested enough to look over the palazzo. Apart from the private apartments and the suite of rooms for small receptions, she had seen nothing of it, she confessed, looking a little surprised. It was clear that she knew nothing, suspected nothing. had lived in that enormous and magnificent building like a lost child in a forest. The doctor felt himself at the end of his resources, till it occurred to him to say that he hoped that she was not specially anxious about her father. No, Madame de Monteveso was not specially anxious. He seemed better this morning. Dr. Martel was very much gratified, and then, by a sudden inspiration, added that it would be a pleasure to give the good news to Mr. Latham, whom he hoped to see this evening. Madame de Monteveso turned rigid with surprise for a moment at the sound of that name. "You have met Mr. Latham?" she faltered out. "Oh, by the merest chance. We are staying at the same inn. He shares my table. He is very attractive." Madame de Monteveso looked no longer as though she expected her visitor to go away. The doctor had just time to note the change before he was asked point blank, "Did Mr. Latham tell you that he was a friend of ours?" He answered evasively that he knew very little about Mr. Latham, except what he could see for himself, that Mr. Latham was very superior to the young men of fashion coming over in such numbers from England since the end of the war. That generation struck him as very crude and utterly uninteresting. It was different as far as Mr. Latham was concerned. A situation had arisen which would make a little information as to his affairs very desirable. "Desirable?" repeated Madame de Monteveso in a whisper. "Yes, helpful." The deliberate stress which he put on that word augmented Madame de Monteveso's bewilderment. "I don't quite understand. In what way? Helpful for you, or helpful for Mr. Latham?" "You see," said the doctor slowly, "though our acquaintance was short, my interest was aroused. I am a useful person to know for those who travel in Italy." Madame de Monteveso sank into a bergère, pointing at the same time to a chair which faced it. But the doctor, after a slight bow, only rested his hand on its high back. At the end of 5 minutes, Adèle was in possession of all the doctor knew about Cosmo's disappearance. She sat silent, her head drooped, her eyes cast down. The doctor was beginning to feel restive when she spoke without looking up. "And this is the real motive for your visit here?" The doctor was moved by the hopeless tone. It might have been an attempt to appear indifferent, but only in a moment she seemed to have become lifeless. "Well," he said, on the spur of the moment it seemed the only thing to do. "There is somebody in the next room. May I shut the door?" "It's only my maid," said Madame de Monteveso. "She couldn't hear us from there." "Well, then, perhaps we'd better leave the door as it is. It's best to avoid all appearance of secrecy." The doctor was thinking of Count Elion, but Madame de Monteveso made no sign. The doctor lowered his voice still more. "I wanted to ask you if you had seen him yesterday, last night." "No." "But he may have called without your knowledge." She admitted that it was possible. People had been sent away from the door on account of her father's illness. There had been no reception in the evening, but Mr. Latham would have asked for her. She thought she would have been told. The doctor suggested that Mr. Latham might have asked for the Count. Madame de Monteveso had only seen her husband for a moment in her father's bedroom the day before, and not at all yet this day. For all she knew, he may have been away for the day on a visit in the country. "But I know nothing of his interests, really," she said in a little less deadened voice. She could not explain to the doctor that she was a stranger in that house, an unwilling visitor with an unsympathetic host, whose motives one cannot help suspecting. Beyond the time she spent by arrangement every year at Count de Monteveso's country house, she knew nothing of his life. What could have been the motives which brought him to Genoa, she had and could have not the slightest idea. She only felt that she ought not to have accepted his pressing invitation to this hired palazzo, but then she could not have come with her father to Genoa, and yet he could not have done without her. And indeed it seemed but a small thing. The alarming thought crossed her mind that all unwittingly she had taken a fatal step. The doctor, who had quite an accurate notion of the state of affairs, hastened to say, "After all, I don't know that this is of any importance. I have heard that Mr. Latham was busy writing all yesterday. If he had come to Italy with some sort of purpose," he continued, as if arguing with himself, "one could—" Then sharply, "You couldn't tell me anything, could you?" he asked Adele. "This is the first time I have seen him for 10 years." Madame de Monteviso raised her eyes, full of trouble, to the doctor's face. "Since we were children together in Yorkshire. We talked of old times, only of old times," she repeated. "Of course, very natural," mumbled the doctor. He made the mental remark that one did not disappear like this after talking of old times. And aloud he said, "I suppose Mr. Latham made the acquaintance of Count de Monteviso?" "Certainly." "I presume that they had an opportunity to have a conversation together?" "I don't think that that Mr. Latham made any confidences to the Count de Monteviso." While saying those words, Adele looked the doctor straight in the face. He was asking himself whether she could read his thoughts, when she got up suddenly and walked away to the window, without haste, and with a grace of movement which aroused the doctor's admiration. He could not tell her what he had in his mind. He looked irresolutely at the figure in the window. It was growing enigmatic in its immobility. He began to feel some little awe, when he heard unexpectedly the words, "You suspect a crime?" The doctor could not guess the effort which went to the uttering of those few words. It was the stunning force of the shock which enabled Adele de Monteviso to appear so calm. It was the general humanity of Dr. Martel's disposition which dictated his answer. "I suspect some imprudence," he admitted in an easy tone. At that moment he drew the gloomiest view of Cosmo's disappearance from the sinister conviction that 24 hours was enough to arrange an assassination. "The difficulty is to imagine a cause for it, to find the motive." Madame de Monteviso continued to face the window as if lost in the contemplation of a vast landscape.